It's my pleasure to be here and speak with you in Project Arizona, truly all across the world. This is so exciting. I'm grateful for this invitation because I'm going to share with you some stories from my own personal life, in particular, the 7 trips I made to Cuba between 1994 and 2007 that have inspired me to do the work that I do to promote freedom in education, grounded in the conviction that each and every one of us is created in the image of God. I don't normally share the stories I'm about to tell you, and the main reason is that if I had spoken publicly about what I was doing in Cuba between 1994 and 2007, I would never have been allowed back in. My mother fled Cuba when she was 20 years old after the Cuban Revolution, imprisoned her family, nationalized all private property, expelled all the clergy, and turned churches into theaters. She married an American, my father, and I was raised in Frederick, Maryland. I always felt close to my Cuban heritage because my mother is one of 14 children. So I had lots of Cuban relatives in the United States, especially in Miami, but of course was never allowed to go to Cuba because the communist regime closed its borders to its own people who left. In 1994, I made my first trip to Cuba kind of on a whim. I was maybe your age, I was in college, and I was on a service trip to Mexico. And it was just a couple of years after the fall of the Soviet Union, and Cuba was now promoting tourist travel because they needed foreign currency. So I hopped on a plane and spent a weekend in Havana. I didn't have time to plan that trip in order to meet my own family still in Havana, much less connect with some of the clergy that my family had been trying to support for decades. But I kept going back, and I'm going to tell you about one trip where I got bolder than ever in terms of what I was trying to do. Each time that I went to Cuba, I realized that people were being denied access to information. Many people had never been exposed to a basics of catechism because atheism was the rule of the land. And I had connected with my own family members, lay people in the Catholic Church, and some heroic priests who were trying to resist the ideology and control of the Cuban regime. At the same time, being a Cuban American, I knew powerful people in the Cuban American community. And I would meet with them in secret in the United States, and they would give me a list of political prisoners in Cuba and ask me to carry thousands of dollars to their wives. So on this trip in 2005, I was carrying $4,000 in cash, all in $20 bills, with a tiny piece of paper as small as I could possibly write with the names of the dissidents whose families I was going to try to contact. Beyond that, some friends in the Catholic Church had asked me to take a DVD player to a Cuban priest so that as part of his catechism classes, he could show movies. I was taking men's clothing, size 10 shoes to my Cuban friend's family. This Cuban friend also asked me to carry a letter and put it at the grave of his deceased mother. Some other friends in the Catholic Church sent me pamphlets about catechism and a box of rosaries. The night before I left, a Cuban friend came over and we packed my suitcase very carefully to make it seem like everything in there belonged to me personally. Yes, even the size 10 men's shoes somehow were going to be mine. An American friend who had traveled to Cuba as part of a medical conference, she called me on the phone and she said, Margarita, listen, you're gonna be fine. But the main thing is, when you go through customs, don't let on that you even speak Spanish, Why don't you just put on a sombrero and some pink lipstick, and for goodness sake, don't look so serious and smart, and pretend like you're just another foreign tourist going to hang out with the good-looking Cuban guys and have a good time. So that's what I did. I flew from Princeton to Cancun. I pretended like I didn't speak Spanish, put on a big hat, some pink lipstick, and played dumb. But I hit a hitch. As they're checking my passport and immigration, I have a US passport. My name, Margarita, could be anything, I could be Italian. So I'm pretending like I don't understand what she's saying, but she takes my bag and she puts it through a scanner. And she saw the DVD player. I'm cool. This is my personal DVD player. It's mine. It's mine. It's mine. Well, she opened it up. And in all that packing, I hadn't pulled off the plastic covering the DVD. And it was obvious that it was brand new. So she looked at me, and she took me over and she put me in line for a special inspection in customs. It was July 31st. I was in the airport in Havana and I was sweating bullets. And I was terrified and I was angry and I was about to cry because I thought my line was busted and everything I had was going to get taken from me. There were a couple of German tourists in front of me, and the police were going through, unrolling every pair of socks, taking everything out of the suitcase and examining the lining. They knew very well that people pretend to be tourists and take all kinds of prohibited items into Cuba. So here I am pretending I don't speak Spanish. I'm fluent in Spanish. And I'm speaking English, but I'm praying inside of my head in Spanish. And so I just blurted out in my head, Santa Maria siempre Virgen, Sangre de Cristo, San Ignacio de Loyola, sácame de aquí. Blood of Christ, Blessed Virgin Mary, Saint Ignatius of Loyola, because it was his feast day, July 31st. Get me out of here. Then they called me up. Aha, DVD player. It's mine. It's mine. Then I heard them say in Spanish, oh, we're going to get someone else to come over and find out how often she comes into Cuba. Because they know that tourists who come to Cuba are often bringing illegal items. So I'm just sweating. The head honcho comes over and he says to me in Spanish, when was the last time you were here? I forget I don't speak Spanish. So I reply, but I reply in English, 2002. Huh? Because he doesn't speak English. And then I screamed in English, 2002. And he looks at me and he goes, go over there. And I thought I was going to be sent to a room to be strip searched. And I'm looking around for where he's sending me. He took me to the exit and he told me to leave. And I walked out and there's my cousin, Celia Rosa. Hey, Mari! And she's screaming and yelling at me in Spanish. I'm terrified they're following me. I grab her and I'm like, Celia Rosa, vamos, vamos. Like, let's go, fast, come on, go, go, go. We went to her apartment in Havana and I couldn't sleep the whole night because I was so scared. At the same time, I felt like such a coward because I knew that this was exactly the reality that people in Cuba had to live with every single day. They lie, they cover up what's inside their bags, and if they get caught, they try to come up with some kind of an excuse so they don't get punished or jailed for doing things as simple as wanting to watch a DVD player or pray the rosary. Later in that trip, I was in Santiago de Cuba, which is on the eastern side of the island. And one of the people to see on my list was a human rights activist. And I had been instructed to call his sister, who had a license to run a small home-based restaurant called a Paladar, and meet him there. So I called, and you speak in this sort of coded language, and I figured she'd understand what I was trying to do. I wanted to meet her brother, and she gave me a time, and I showed up. When I showed up, her brother was there, and he said to me, "I'm really sorry, but my sister made a mistake. My phone line is tapped." And she called and said, "There was a foreigner here who wanted to meet with me, and I've been followed. Look out the window." And there was this guy in a Cuban military uniform standing on the corner upright, looking straight up at our balcony. And he said, and I got nervous. And he said, "It's okay. It's okay. Look, they do this all the time. He's probably not going to stop you when you leave, but he's trying to scare you. And he wants you to know that you're being followed. So the best thing you can do is pretend like you don't see him and you don't care." So he sent me out to the balcony to have a drink and pretend like I was having a good time for about 30 minutes. Afterwards, I came back in, I did the interview with him, I wrote down all of the things he was telling me about the human rights violations in Cuba, rolled it up in a little piece of paper, stuck it inside of my bra, took my camera, took out the digital photos of him and other dissidents I had been meeting with, put a different digital file in there that had pictures of me doing touristy things in case they took my camera, that I was just having fun. And I walked out. And he told me, "Do not go back to your host right now because they're following you." I was staying with a Cuban family that I was friends with, this time pretending not to be an American, but to be their relative from Havana, because the Committee for the Defense of Revolution will come and knock on your door if there's someone staying there who's not normally there. They need to know who I am. So I was pretending to be a Cuban from another part of the island. And I walked out that day and I was scared. I walked to the Central Plaza in Santiago de Cuba and I walked into church. And a priest was preaching from Corinthians 2, the second letter of Corinthians, verse number 4. Sorry, 2 Corinthians 4, verse 8. "We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not abandoned, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies." After a little while, I walked back to the house where I was staying in Santiago, and my hostess, whose name was also Margarita, said to me, "I don't know where you went, but you were gone for a long time, and I think I know what you were doing. And I'm going to tell you something. Tú estás marcada. You have been marked." That's what she told me. That's a Cuban word for you've been found out, you've been discovered, and they're watching you. The hard part was that even though I loved her and I trusted her and I wanted to help her, the Cuban regime makes it so that you don't tell the people in your own family or friendship circle where you're going or who you're talking to. Because if they know and you won't give information, they will go after your family and your friends. I don't share these stories very often because I struggle with the reality that although I thought I was doing something courageous, I was actually too scared to go back. And there was parts of me that wanted to continue helping directly political prisoners and dissidents in the church in Cuba. But I realized that I had to make a choice, and that if I was going to speak with my full conscience about what I believed to be true and right and good, I wasn't going to be allowed in. So I felt that God was calling me to a vocation in education. And I dedicated myself to finishing my degree, becoming a professor, and helping shape young minds to appreciate the freedom of the press and the freedom of association and the freedom of religion, while also continuing my own work on immigration from Haiti or from Mexico, while studying resilience and trauma amongst young adults. But I never forgot the fear that I experienced in Cuba, or the hope and the perseverance and the courage that I met amongst the dissidents. But one thing I learned being in Cuba, and this is why I'm speaking about this today to you, one thing I learned is that organized systems of oppression are so strong that most people don't resist. My sense was that 80% of the people around were going along with injustice because they didn't want to face the consequences of speaking up. But I also believe that those 20% of people who have a well-formed conscience and who are courageous can do way more good using their God-given gifts than people who go along with injustice. But I think as I've matured in my life, I've also realized that this 80-20 rule applies to each and every one of us in the sense that 80% of the time, most of what we're doing because we've developed habits of mind, virtues, or vices. And 20% of the time, we're thinking, deliberating, and acting with a clear sense of all of the consequences and all the steps that we have to think through. But one of the most important things that education does is shape us so that the 80% of the time, what we're doing, what we're listening to, how we're speaking, where we're going, has been shaped for the good. And what I've tried to do by starting Scala Foundation, I started it 5 years ago, almost, really 4, but I became worried that too many students were willing to have their voices be silenced because they didn't want to fall out of friendship, supposedly, with people who disagreed with them. And I thought something was wrong with this picture because friendship isn't based on untruths. There's no such thing as friendship without truth. What did I experience in Cuba? All this language of solidarity and revolution, but a complete denial of personal freedoms and personal conscience. Well, that doesn't lead to unity. It might lead to some kind of forced kind of cooperation, but true unity and true friendship has to be based on knowledge of the truth and love for the truth. But it seemed that a lot of young people were opting to protect themselves by not speaking the truth. And at some point, if you don't speak the truth, you're not looking for the truth anymore. And you can start to not know that you're repeating slogans and spewing lies, which is what I saw all over Cuba. So in Scala's summer program, which I've done now for 4 years, and I'll be doing again this summer, I try to get students to look at different philosophies of education in order to get them to ask themselves, what is it they're doing in their education and why? And in particular, I present them with authors who I think should be read by anybody who has a stake in education or cares about human freedom. People like Jacques Maritain, who in his book, Education at a Crossroads, was actually developed out of a series of lectures he gave at Yale in the mid-1940s while World War II was raging in Europe.
Very formal.
And Maritain argued that although he admired the United States in its system of education, he was a Frenchman. He admired the United States with all of its emphasis on technical education and scientific advancement, all of its advancement in student-centered kinds of teachings and experiential education. But he warned that no set of credentials, no social role, no political system could ever replace the true end of education, which is, quoting him in Education at the Crossroads, to guide man in the evolving dynamism through which he shapes himself as a human person. armed with knowledge, strength of judgment, and moral virtues, while at the same time conveying to him the spiritual heritage of the nation and the civilization in which he is involved, and preserving in this way the century-old achievements of generations. Maritain had converted to Catholicism from atheism and knew very well the ideological structure of education in the Soviet Union, communist Soviet Union, and fascist Nazi, and in Nazi Germany. And although the definition I just read may not seem particularly unusual to you, like why does this stand out? There's a really deep critique in what he says against other understandings of education that are very prominent in the United States, and I would guess in other places as well. And some other thinkers that have really influenced education in the US and internationally are people like John Dewey and Paulo Freire. And the main critique that I have of Dewey and Freire, look, Dewey is well known for his views of experiential education, thinking of the classroom as an experiment, eliciting from students their creativity and tinkering with things. But the problem with Dewey is that he doesn't think that there's a role for tradition or preserving past knowledge in education. Knowledge is always forward-looking. It's always experimental. It's always progressive. Towards the end of his life, Dewey acknowledged that there had to be some other end to education, but he kind of ended up making it the social end of sustaining democracy. But Dewey, although he's thought of more as an innovator in education, he was a philosopher, and he explicitly rejected an element of Maritain's understanding of the person, which I aver is the understanding of the person in most wisdom traditions and most religious traditions, which is that each human person is endowed with a soul that cannot be reduced to one or another social role. And that soul has the capacity for direct communication with our Creator. Now, I'm not denying that God is immanent and involved in the world, but for Dewey, the only way we could talk about God was through action in the world. But this formation of the inner conscience, this ability to judge right and wrong, this love for the truth, for Dewey gets completely subsumed to one or another social or political end. Similarly, for Paulo Freire, whose book on education is entitled Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire replaces truth-seeking and the formation of the conscience of the individual person. He replaces that as the end of education and says the end of education is consciousness raising based on problem solving. But again, Freire's method of dialogue and bringing students to think about their social and political context may sound like, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you read Freire's entire book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it's very clear. He spells it out very clearly, especially in chapter 4, that the problem they're trying to solve is capitalist oppression. And his exemplars in education include people like Chairman Mao and Che Guevara, who ultimately didn't believe in the dignity of the person and were perfectly happy to engage in violence against people who didn't agree with their version of the truth. So consciousness raising and dialogue for Freire may sound good, but it's got to be oriented to his understanding of revolution. And if it's not, there's that freedom, because you're undermining the ultimate goal, which is a social political one. So again, Maritain's focus on the inner dynamism of the student and the freedom of conscience of the student as the means and ends of education is a warning that education should not be uniquely controlled by government or only done in schools. Maritain's vision, as well as the vision of an author named Luigi Giussani, his book Risk of Education, they're worried that educational systems that embrace a notion of collective political liberation but reject personal liberation, become very easy to turn into another kind of collective God that subjugates the freedom of the individual to one or another political goal. For Giussani, words like solidarity completely lose their meaning if you do not have respect for the mystery of each person's conscience, which is capable of connecting with a transcendent God. So, going back to what I learned in Cuba and how I think this plays out into the spirit of what I do and what is the message I want to leave you with. Well, it was only actually today as I was preparing this talk that I went back to 2 Corinthians and looked at the earlier verses before the one I read to you. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 also says in verses 6 and 7, let light shine out in darkness. The light has shone out in darkness and shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. For we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. So the first lesson I want to leave you with is that in some ways, in a different way, each and every one of us has been marcada or marcado, marked, but not in the way that I was marked in Cuba. You have been marked with an irreducible dignity because you're a creature of God, and nobody, no political regime, no matter what they do to your body, can take away your dignity. Because you have been ransomed by a God who loved the world so much that he became a man and walked on this earth and gave up his body to redeem us, to reclaim us for that dignity for which we have been created. So that 80-20 rule that I told you about, I used to apply that to other people. You know, I'm in the 20 of the good people who have a good conscience and everyone else is in the 80. Well, as I mentioned, I've realized that 80-20 rule applies to me. But by the grace of God who has ransomed me from the darkness within me, I too would give in to fear and turn on the people right around me. So I ask you, in whatever situation you're in, that you listen to that 20% of you that does not want to go along with injustice. Do not harm the name or the reputation of anybody around you, even if they've hurt you. The most heroic people I met in Cuba forgave the people who tried to harm them. Because if you don't, you're letting the darkness inside of you, and it's going to come out somehow, one way or another. This is how evil systems perpetuate themselves. They spread the darkness. I also want to encourage you to think about what authentic friendship is and what that has to do with education. I am very disheartened by so many students in the United States of America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, who tell me that when they walk into the classroom, they're essentially putting on a costume, just as I did going through immigration and customs in Cuba, where they're pretending to think a certain way, where they're adapting their speech to what they think people want them to say or think. And they're coming out as conflicted and as torn as I was when I was wearing a costume and lying left and right about the fact that I was doing things that I believed were true, beautiful, and good. So What I want education in the United States and across the world to get back to is this fundamental idea of human persons created for freedom, that the role of education is to impart knowledge, but also to form the moral conscience for which schools must work with families, with religious institutions of different kinds, because the greatest treasure is the spark inside each and every student that makes them unique, irreplaceable, and with a vocation from God to bring light into the world. But we have got to worry about education being manipulated and controlled to spread darkness. There must be a place for disinterested, leisurely, creative, imaginative forms of education that help students fall in love with the beauty of seeking the truth and fall in love with the idea that inside of each and every one of us there is a mystery that we'll never fully comprehend, but that each of us has a unique subjectivity and a God-given freedom. And in Cuba, where God was killed and made illegal in the Constitution to worship God, they killed beauty. They killed friendship. And people were not living with inner peace. And without that inner peace that comes from love and beauty and the pursuit of truth, there is no progress. And there is no freedom. Thank you.